Why? With the lovely disclaimer, always.
Yes,
So no mafia comes and takes us away.
dude. You can't be like the giant but butterfly nets. Like, sorry.
Exactly. But I mean, today's topic: how to succeed in your first 90 days.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Mm-hmm.
I thought about naming it "How to Not Get Fired in Your First 90 Days" was the other way, but
Cool.
I, I I don't know. I didn't think many people would be interested if I was like, "How to Not Get Fired in Your First 90 Days," because I figured it'd be like low level stuff of like, don't punch your coworkers, like don't delete prod.
Yep.
Um,
Good start. Good start. Um, yeah, I think I'm 50 days away from not getting fired at my first 90, so let's hold my breath. We're
so,
making progress. This is a hard question though. And
oh, you think so? Really?
I think it is difficult for people who possibly have their first job
Mm-hmm.
or their first jump in their career where their expectations are different. Like you're a team lead, you're not necessarily delivering code, or you're a manager, you're not necessarily doing IC work, or you're a manager of managers. Like now things are fundamentally different. The same recipe that got you here might not get you to the next step. So that would be, I think that's the category of people who would be having an interesting time. My take on it is take advantage of your noob status. You can ask questions in the first 90 days and be the idiot. No one cares. So, do you,
Yeah, I was gonna say that the, yeah, being new is one thing, but also this is the time to make your team really like you, which is just to find a project or work on something that no one else has time for.
mm-hmm.
But because you're new, you're not part of any sort of like capacity planning. You're not on any sort of like real sprints. Nobody's product isn't like, why is Kyle not working on X? They're like, oh, he's new, he's ramping up, right? Like, so you can be the Kyle person who's just chilling and being like, I'm learning. But really, you could be like, oh God, why is this tool over here so garbage? Like, why don't I just start there and fix it?
Exactly that. I think you're 100% right. You don't have meetings, so you can actually work your calendar. You don't have politics because you potentially haven't been there. These are all the pros I'm finding compared to my previous job. So it's like, I don't have to worry about squeezing in an hour-long meeting because I've got all the legacy stuff to worry about, or legacy in terms of like previous projects or anything like that.
Yep.
But something you mentioned when we chatted a while back about becoming a manager for the first time. The thing that resonated really hard with me was when you come in, you're expected to make impact, but what that means is not reinventing the wheel. There's a big difference between arriving and being like, I've arrived, forget everything you know, I'm here to change everything. And that's not what you want to do. Like you said, things have survived. The house didn't burn down while you were busy signing your
Oh
onboarding
yeah,
documentation.
it was
So yeah.
just my mentor, CTO of a company came in and he said like, yeah, you even at that level, even at exec level, you when you first join, your thing is not to change a whole bunch. It's worked this long, it will survive, but you've also been brought in. So at some point, yes, you're probably brought in to make change. Therefore, you got to make change. But take your time, figure out where you want to be, what you want to change, what your like most valuable contribution could be for your time or whatnot, and then do it. But
Mm-hmm.
early on, it's just like sit and look and listen. And that's why I was saying, like, if you can find something that is overlooked, great, you could start there. Especially if like you get in stand up and the teams are all like, "Oh God damn it, the tool always breaks. We never have time to fix it," because it it wins goodwill from your teammates because you're going to go fix something that they all want to go
Mm-hmm.
fix. They're definitely going to be helpful in giving you like the insight of like, hey, where do I find the pipeline for this thing? It's not documented anywhere. Oh yeah, it's over here in this hidden section. Like they're incentivized to get you moving forward instead of like this, like, oh, you're working on some other random project that's like, I don't know, like or the worst case is you're on a team and you get assigned to something and no one on the team has worked on it. Then you're like,
Way too now.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think, You make a great point about like the documentation situation as well. The team didn't necessarily do a poor job in documenting things. It just so happens that they haven't had fresh eyes look at it in some time. And your first, not even your first 90 days, I would say your first 10 working days, like the first 2 weeks before you become sort of indoctrinated by the team's way of doing things, you can arrive and be like, why the hell did we call this tool this? Like, it doesn't make sense. It's not named after what it's doing. Or why are the docs for everything in place X, but the one I need is in place Y? Like, what's going on here? Later on, you just fit in.
I was gonna say one of the things is always like, how do I even get started? And there'll be a README with like 200-page long README, and you're just like, cool, but how do I actually start? Like, and they're like, well, it's in the README. You're like, yeah, if I want to read 200 pages, but like,
yes,
like how do I run this thing? Like, what is step one?
You say that. I literally had a situation this week where I had the long README, and the README was like, to understand what you're doing, you need context. Go here for an overview of the project. So I read that. I'm like, cool, I understand now. Then it's like, go here, cool, read this. This is how you trigger the tests. Awesome, trigger the tests. The tests take 3 hours and 45 minutes to run. Had it started with kick off the tests, this is what's going on, my life would have been a lot happier. The fact that I'd finished reading all the stuff, and by the time the test got kicked off, it was well into the evening. So I'm like, now what?
It's like step one. You don't have the context, but start the test. Here's how to start the test. They take 4 hours, then continue reading the README.
Exactly that. And it's not necessarily just because it's badly written. It's well written test. It's just a very complex pipeline that's running, that's doing a lot of stuff. And none of that becomes apparent until 2 lines before the end of the document. And you're like, oh, I see. This is probably going to take a long time to run. Hit run. And it's like, oh, ETA 4 hours. Like, God damn it. So there are things there that are like, you can be successful to your team very early on by just raising your hand, being like, I'm the new guy. Like, sorry if I sound stupid, but maybe we just put a little like flag on the top of the wiki page. This will take a long time to run. Maybe start it, then read. Like, could save 3 hours. So
one of my coworkers had written a very lengthy README, but when you get near the bottom, it's like, listen, if you don't care about all these exceptions and all this shit, and you just want to get started, here's the 3 commands. I literally copy paste, and this person was out of office on vacation, and I was able to like get up and running and fixing things. And it's like, thank God this existed, because I had no other idea. And everything else is like all these exceptions of like, we'll only run this if you're in this one scenario, but don't do this, and then delete this, and there's a state file over here, and you're like, I just want the shit to run on my computer. Like,
that's it. Just get me going. And how do I get going as quickly as possible? So I guess that's probably one of the things you want to aim for. When you arrive, get to a place, like, it can be stupid, like the things I've been doing this week where I have no idea what the codebase does. However, there's a set of tests. Let me try running them. Because firstly, I'm scared of them taking 3 hours after the thing that happened earlier. The other thing is, I'm going to make a change. I'm assuming the tests actually work on the environment that I'm running them on. Maybe they don't. Maybe I make a change, and it turns out that that's like an existing bug, something that's been there for a long time.
Known thing. It's like, oh yeah, that test is always flaky.
So you can be that person who is ultra conservative, ultra kind of question focused. There are no stupid questions. The first while you're there, no one is going to call you out for making a like. Don't repeat questions unless you're not getting an actual answer. But besides that, I think you can ask anything, and you should be asking a ton of questions. You should be asking things along the lines of stupid things like, why is this not working? Or more importantly, I got this error. I looked internally. I found the following thing. This is what I think it is. Do you agree? And then even if you are completely off the mark, which did happen recently, the person who you're talking to goes, I see you putting in initiative. You spend like an hour looking in here. This is what I think it is. Go down this path. So just leverage the fact that it's kind of judgment free, and you can move a lot faster.
Do you find it useful reading the test being new? Because that's we've talked about this before. I think maybe off air that like on open source projects,
Yeah.
if I ever have to try and contribute something or even get an idea of how it works, I don't even read the code. I first start with the test because the tests talk about from the use case.
Yes.
The test will say something like test coordination of the coordinator between multiple nodes. Great. I know whatever this code touch is going to be related to, like this multi-tenant stuff and this multi-coordination and whatever. And then from there, I can start exploring. But when you start in like, whatever language would be like your main.java or whatever, it's like, okay, yeah, but this file calls out to like, 100,000 other files through everything else. Like, so I don't know. How do you start getting familiar with the code base, I guess?
I took that approach because the project I worked on before had massively overloaded terminology that was almost impossible to actually understand what the hell a person was talking about without first understanding what they were actually talking about, as weird as that sounds. So you would look at the code and it would be like validate config. Okay, cool. So I'm updating the logic to validate the config. What the hell does valid mean? What does validation mean? What is going on here? Is the config local? Is it remote? What's going on? And then you open the test and you're like, oh, I see. Config file can't be greater than 2 megs. We've got a test for that. The config file needs the following sections. All of that is clearly accessible and easily available through the test. And it takes you 20 minutes to read the test document or the testing code, opposed to like opening the, hey, this is how you get started. And here's like section 1. So yes, testing for sure. Hopefully someone has written tests that make sense and covers most of the stuff. And it's just a lot easier to dive in and give you context.
Also kind of highlights the blind spots of where you should watch out. Like if you go through the test and then you realize, oh man, there's a lot of code that calls this other component, but I don't see any test on it. So if you have to touch anything related to that, like there's no guardrails, there's no nothing. This is probably not the feature that you want to first be like, hey, I want to work on X. It's like, that's probably not the thing you want to start with.
So absolutely. I think that looking at tests, if you can get unit tests that are written well, and I don't mean coverage wise, I mean like the test name says what it does, or the documentation associated with the actual test says it, and you can get code coverage, it's a huge step forward. But like you're saying, if the code coverage includes 25 callouts to big scary service.do stuff, and there's no any kind of testing in there, you probably want to stay away. Like for me, I also try and reduce the number of things I'm looking at when I start a job. Like give me the most trivial change possible so I can learn how to pull your code, make the change, run the tests, send out the PR. Then I'll go like one step deeper. If you're diving in and it's like, hey, there's not much unit testing, it's a little bit of documentation. We might call out to the big scary service that might be working or might not be working. Good luck. And hope you don't point to prod by mistake. Like that's the
like prior times you've talked about.
Yes.
I think to succeed well in your first 90 days, you have to get familiar with the code base. I think we both agree that looking at the test is an easy way to get familiar, or maybe not necessarily the easy way, but
it could be a low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And I don't think a lot of people think that way. I think a lot of people try and go through the code itself. And because this is how I see most people get onboarded on the various teams I've been, like, is it down and then they start reading like the wiki pages and then they're going through the code and they're trying to get understanding of like class hierarchy and whatnot and how things are coupled and what's not coupled. But I really think the tests are like a good shortcut in ramping up, as well as you get a feel for the terminology of what people call, especially when you get into products where it's like, this thing used to be called this. Yeah, that name's still sort of used, but we don't call it anymore. It's called blah, blah, but no one updated the test, and that's why it's called that. But the code has been changed, and, And I had another point is, but I guess it escapes me.
Yeah,
So.
it's exactly like you're saying. So from a code understanding perspective, I guess the higher up goal here, or the overarching reason for doing this is, if you're coming in as a dev, or even a manager who's going to be involved in the technical aspect, your team owns something that does something, or maybe doesn't do something. You need to understand the lay of the land there as quickly as you can, and understand the tooling, because first 90 days, you're chilled, everything's fine. If you're there for like 5 months, 6 months, and then you start asking junior engineers like, hey, why did my code review not work the way it was meant to? And it turns out that you've like completely butchered it and gone around things that are mentioned in like 4 or 5 different places. It's less tolerant. So your goal is upskill on the bits you can as quickly as you can, and understand what the hell your team does, or the company is doing, if it's a smaller company, or the space, or the org, or whatever, and figure out the tooling that you're going to be expected to be engage with, and go from there. Then I think that you have some kind of a jump off point, or point to progress from. Yes, you remembered.
Yeah. I was going to also say to try and pick something that is non-critical.
Yes.
And on timeline and in the code base itself. So not a part of some critical path that's going to, if I make a mistake, blow up the entire X service or whatever you're working on. So isolation is really good when you're first starting. And then secondly, on something that isn't tied to some crazy deadline, preferably, is, you want to start small. You want to find something that's isolated. You want to find something that there's no enormous amount of expectation that, there's 9 teams that depend on this and you're now working on it, because
that's it.
You're still grasping at trying to figure out where you're going and what is what, and what you're not in the position to even know if certain requirements should be argued out because it's not beneficial for the customer, it's not beneficial for the business, or even if it doesn't technically, it could technically make sound. But then when you understand where the business is going, you might say, no, this feature doesn't make sense because
we've got to move.
Yeah, XYZ. The company said no longer are we doing that. We're going to use gRPC for all of our communication between services. So why are you asking me to implement it this way? I think that's a very good way of succeeding early on is starting with the test, finding something that's isolated, no strong deadlines on it, and it's early success. It's an early win. Preferably on something that your teams want themselves, like internally. So
I think something you mentioned that was interesting is, if you can find something that the team itself wants but has not been able to prioritize. The team's been doing just fine with it as it is, but they haven't gotten priority there for whatever the reason might be. And if you can fix that, you may very well get a lot of backing from your team going forward. You arrive and you're like, your logs suck. Why do we have 25,000 errors for like some stupidly simple error? And everyone says, oh no, it's fine. We've just not gotten around to fixing it because it's laborious. That's a perfect candidate. You're going to be reading the code anyway. You're going to be so slow to move through it that moving through it and changing like log lines is not going to slow you down that much more. And now at the end of it, you can say to the team like, hey, I read through the pipeline that does XYZ. I noticed that like we didn't have consistent logging, and that's where the errors were coming from here. I added that. What do you guys think? And everyone's happy. So there are sweet spots to where you can really contribute, make a difference in a sensible way without being like, what's the scariest thing right now? Like, who's the biggest dude in the yard so I can go like pick a fight? That's not what you want to do.
And something like the logs will help you yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're new, you don't have all the knowledge. Having the better logs is definitely going to help you down the line.
Exactly that.
And you know that the logs are working because you went and fixed it. So it's not like, well, I didn't know I was supposed to turn on the special flag to enable logging for me to actually figure that out. Like, well, in order for you to test your changes, you need, and it's so critical. Like you need and you had already mentioned this, like the pipeline, you need to know how that works. You need to know how to run the test, right? Because one, I need to know how to make sure my code actually goes through all the sanity checks and actually goes out to some sort of environment at some point. And the test is my guardrails. But there are other things as we're getting to, which is like the logs, like where do I find them? Where do you write them? Okay, like the pipeline passed, there's an issue, the test passed. Okay, but I need additional information, right? And I can't reproduce it in my environment or whatever. Like, how do I get this? Where is it? Where is it going?
Yep.
Do we even log this? Like, okay.
Yeah. So these are things that I think are company specific. Most companies, unless you're fortunate to like be moving from one company that say uses GitHub and GitHub Actions for deployment or something like that, it's unlikely you're going to arrive somewhere else and be like, oh, this is how you do it. And even then, the way they branch, the way that commits are handled, the way tickets are followed through, the logging system is unlikely to be the same. All of these things are table stakes. If you're working a production scale system, this is what's expected of you. And you can help. You can get into a conversation at least and understand the context. If you're finding yourself doing some boring training videos, you can dive into the logs with them and be like, okay, can I at least just see where you guys are finding them? Or talk to some engineer who's just figured out a potential issue. You can dive in and talk to her or inquire about what the similarities are between what you've done and what they're doing and try and do that. But don't arrive and say things like, oh, in my company, we did this and it worked so well. There's few and far between situations that has turned out well, in my opinion. If you arrive and you start telling everyone how we want to run it like the company you've just come from, why the hell did you leave? And there's probably a good reason it's the way it is. So heads up with that one.
I mean, I'll say that there are times where it is the opposite, but it is far and few. It is usually when you are brought in because of X.
Yes.
Like that is your expertise. The company hired you for that expertise. Yeah. You're now on said team. You're like, yeah, I know that's the way it's been done. It's got problems. That's why I'm here. But ignoring that, I was going to say that I think another good spot to rapidly accelerate the learning, because that's kind of what it comes down to, is your first 90 days, you need to make a contribution. You need to grasp what you're working on and be, committing essentially on a frequency that meets whatever the company needs or features, whichever way you want to look at it. And I was going to say, we had talked about the test, reading the test, and I think that that's solid, but I don't think a lot of people look at that. The other thing I don't think a lot of people look at it is the pull request. And I only recently started doing this when I came onto Teams, is going through the prior closed pull request to get an idea of like what expectations are on the code, what internal conventions that maybe aren't set on the tooling on the pipeline itself. Yep. Because either the language didn't have it or no one implemented it, or there's a split on the code base so that it's really tedious if they were to implement it. So you have this divide. And then from there, I was going to say, I don't know how you feel about this, but I think there's value in pairing with people, not just on the programming side, but on the actual pull request. Yeah. Because you're going to have early days with people, and there's not a lot of stuff right away, and there's not a lot of features that you can work on with not having that prior context or how these systems work. And I think that helps a lot of other people, because rarely do people pair on pull requests. Like they will pair in the sense of giving feedback back and forth on pull requests, but they're not sitting. They're not virtually in a call with someone being like, here's what I'm looking through this pull request. Here's what I think is wrong with this. Here's where I think there's pitfalls. Here's why I'm telling Mary about blah, 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 or John about it. So. Yep.
This week.
Just yep.
No, I'm like, that is exactly the approach I'm taking. And I'm trying not to like agree for the sake of agreeing. And I'm hoping it was the right approach. This week, I took an approach like that. And the thing that I realized was you want to get to a place where you can talk to the person you're doing the pairing with and not sound like you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, because you're wasting their time. If you're in the PR, like if you decide you're going to pair up, and in my case, we had a code base. The scope of the code base that I was changing was small, not very big at all. It was a core piece though. And the question around it was, do we change some or other attributes about this and how these attributes are addressed and changed? Cool. Simple-ish task. Look at it for an hour. This is what they're thinking. Let's do it. You make the changes. You're like, okay, hold on. This change cascades to this place, to this place, to this place. Now you're starting to step on toes of when this PR was cut. Oh, sorry. When this ticket was cut or task was cut, they said it should just be here. But now I'm being forced to change other things. Don't jump into a call with someone and be like, hey, I haven't spent any time at all. I want 3 hours of your time. Tell me why I don't know what's happening. And then every step of the way, they're like, oh, if you see the logs here and you're like, oh, how did you find the logs? Like, yes, you can do it, but that's not the main part of the conversation. You're taking the time of an engineer there, potentially. The approach I took was take an hour or two, get to a place where I have almost an elevator pitch for the context, which was the change you were tasking me with said I should do this. I did that. It ended up overflowing to all these areas. It's starting to feel like either the change is bigger than was expected or this is totally wrong and we shouldn't be doing this. And then it was like, okay, cool. I see your concern. What are the technical issues you're actually scared of here? Like, what are the points that are changing that you think are problematic? Pointed them out and went, hey, this is maybe going to be a little bit iffy later on. This is impacting the maintainability of the code. This is impacting the test scope as well. Like, do we have tests that cover this? I think we do, but I'm not sure. Now, what you've done is taken 3 hours of that person's time and distilled it into 3 hours of your time on your own, and you're just posing questions, ideally yes or no questions. And doing that, the person you're talking to feels like you're not wasting their time and they're willing to part so much more information. So it's like, hold on, this is similar to this file. Let's go here. And it becomes a collaboration, not a interactive tutoring session. So I think that's the thing I was trying to get away from, because I've been there where an intern will be like, hey, I looked at your ticket. It doesn't make sense. I'm like, why? You told me to change X and Y, but there's also Z. So I'm like, okay, what is the concern? No, you told me to change X and Y. So I'm like, do you think we should change Z? And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, have you looked at it at all? No. Okay, well, go away. You're wasting my time. Like, that's the kind of sentiment you could get if a person is on call or busy or having a shitty day. So try learning quickly, but I think it comes back to what you said with like making impact, not just on code, having a positive impact on your peers. Be the person who's like, when Corey comes to chat to me, I know I'm not going to be confronted with a bazillion questions that are just not appropriate for the current conversation. Those questions can be posed. You could pose them as like, I've IM'd you a couple of things. When you get a chance, do you mind pointing me to the documentation about the release system? Do you mind pointing me out how did you find that this was a log message that caused the failure? I'm seeing 25 of them. So yeah, I think to play devil's advocate on the side of like a grumpy engineer who's being overworked and underpaid, there's not a lot of expectation you can put on them to be like, you have to help me. It's not that way. So yeah, pairing, but do it efficiently, do it effectively.
I think, do it efficiently. And also just convenience is probably a big factor too, which is, if you can pose these questions in whatever Slack, Teams, internal chat, whatever it may be, and just put them in there and, hey, these are questions I've realized that, in my first week. And if anyone has any sort of insights to them or could answer them, just when you get a chance, could you let them know? And someone will go in and start a thread, either whoever you report into or someone else on the team. And maybe they don't have an answer for all of it, or someone's 3 hours behind you on it on the West Coast. Well, you're on the West Coast. So for me, I'll pose the question, you'll answer 3 hours later.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah, so I think this is a good spot of like flipping the script and saying how to how do you not succeed in 90 days? Like what is something aside from just deleting production?
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
like what do you think are common pitfalls that people just miss?
I arrived, I did what my mentor said. What more do you want from me? Like there's that poster that's like, I'm up and dressed, what more do you want? That's the kind of vibe you get. Some companies are very lightweight with onboarding. I've been at a company where it was like, here's your desk, here's your computer, check your email. And that was onboarding. Like you walk away. Then I've been at others where it's a multi-week process.
Mm-hmm.
If you are unsure, ask your manager, like, is the expectation for me to just get through my onboarding training? Are you expecting me, like, tell me what you want? One of my very first jobs, my manager said to me, you have the academic experience to do this. You have no practical experience at all. First 2 weeks, all I want you to do is read these books. Read the books, join the meetings, and understand the context of what we're doing. That's it. And that was my mandate. Did that, helped a huge amount, got me in the right direction because firstly, I did what was asked of me. So the manager is the one who determines my success over there. You've got to at least do what's being requested or come up with a good reason why. The other thing was it made total sense. Then I've been in a space where it's like I mentioned, here's your desk, here's your laptop. I could have sat on my ass and been like, well, I watched the HR training. I know how to do all the things that are expected of me. I know where the fire escapes are. I'm going home. And that's not what was expected. I was expected to be able to figure things out. Now, with my new role, it's a different situation where the expectation is find a place within the company that I can operate. And this is not the same as the technical onboarding, but if I pick badly, I'm not going to be able to have impact, and that's going to screw me. So don't, I guess all of this boils down to manage the expectations well. Gather the expectations and requirements from your manager, from your peers, from your mentor, from anything, and do that. If you want to fail real quick, ignore them and don't ask questions from those people because these aren't necessarily work questions. Like just arrive. And then I think the other one is arrive, tell everyone that they're shitty at their job and where you just came from because you're amazing. You should do it this way. That's probably
Yeah. You have to be humble. Like there's a place and time when you have expertise to fight your side of the argument, but when you're new, you have no idea if that's your like if you should even be in that place to make that argument. You don't even know what your the people around you what their background is, what their expertise is. You could be saying one thing and it's like
completely.
that person wrote that fucking library. Like,
yes.
like
That's exactly that. There are situations where if you're growing in your skills and you're growing in your social network and you're finding more and more people, there will be a time where you're like, I'm so sick and tired of using shitty logging libraries. And someone's like, oh, what do you use? And you're like, oh, I use X. And you're like, oh, I'm the core contributor to that. And you're like, oh, okay. And then you get, because then you're probably going to find out how badly you're using it. So don't go in naively and be like, of course I know more than this entire army of engineers or 5 years. Yes, there are cases where it's like, this is legacy, it's shit, give us a new solution. Cool. But don't go in and do that. The other thing, don't arrive and start claiming you've been misleveled before you understand what you're actually doing compared to what you actually should be doing. If you arrive, and I say this because I've worked with some engineers who've arrived and were told like, we're going to ramp you up. We're going to give you a very, very simple code change to do just so you can get used to the build system, the deployment, the logging, and the metrics. They did that. 2 weeks later, they're like, I think I've been leveled incorrectly. I probably need a bump in my title and pay because I can do better than the tasks I'm doing. You're like, yes, of course you can. You're not doing your job right now. You're just doing your training wheels on. Like, take it easy. So yes, there's a thing there that you want to be careful about, like starting that conversation.
Okay. I was gonna say, so in those first 90 days, do you think it's just only about grasping the code base and finding contributions, or do you think someone should be trying to find a way of going like, I don't know, like where do you start questioning like, okay, I need to start making long-term plans instead of like the short-term, like,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, probation period, contributing to the team, understanding the company, like, the initial stuff that is my requirement. Like, where do you start planning out, or is it in the first 90 days that you start planning out this more like long-term, like, okay, these are the things that I'm definitely going to want to tackle, or
Mm-hmm.
I need to start working on X in parallel to everything else to be able to do Y.
Yeah,
Um,
that is
how do you approach this?
that's a good question. I think it's super interesting because this is one of the conversations we're having where I'm like in the thick of it, having started the job and like midway in my sort of 90-day situation. We were expected to put together a profile to find a team within the company, which made us ask questions like, what are you interested in? And the questions start very easy, like, do you want to do front end, back end, or like product or sales or support or whatever? Like you can imagine very simple, superficial questions. And then the next ones are, what's actually important to you? Now you're like, well, I'm not sure. If you're in a big company, the diversity of what's important varies wildly. You could be in a massive distribution company, and what you're interested in is ensuring all internal staff have a pleasant experience with their internal services. So you want to
Yep.
write all the HR stuff. You don't want to see the outside world. You just want to be in a company that has a large number of staff. And the most important thing for you is making everyone's life happy inside. Then you
Yep.
could be the opposite and you're like, I don't care about anything else. All I want to do is improve the number of clicks we get on this product. So
Yep.
understanding yourself and then being able to have that conversation early on is probably good as well because
It's
you
like
can, yeah,
I was
go
gonna
ahead.
say the questions are like, if you had a choice, would you give up your eyesight, your smell, or your hearing? And you're like, oh God. You're like, the first question is like, what technology stack would you like to work with? Would
Yeah,
you like to work in front and back end? And if you had to give up one of your sites, why would you give it? Which one and why? And you're like,
yeah. Where did this
what
go?
happened there? Like,
Yeah, exactly that. It goes from being completely simple to being not simple at all. Sorry, my watch is going crazy.
right.
So that's an interesting situation because you can set very honest expectations with management and have the conversation because sometimes if it's an early company or early phase of a company, they could be like, well, we're progressing. We're probably going to have a marketing team spin off of this. We're going to have a internal team that does services. We'll try and prioritize that. Often you can't, you don't have the luxury to do that because you've been employed to do a specific job. But there is a long-term planning and situation as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to be more pragmatic about it in that I'm like, all I want to do is survive because I don't have enough insight on the inside to know how the rules really work. I'm not operating by the rule book as much as I'm operating based on the sales brochure. So once I know what's actually happening inside, I can plan these things a little bit more. But I'm starting to try and make sure my the first 90 days are at least set my trajectory to be somewhat in line, like not wildly off. And who knows, if I was at a certain company and I said to them, like, I'm so glad you guys brought me in. I'm really interested in the initiative you're doing to reduce carbon emissions in your data centers. And they go, actually, you know what? We've scrapped that project completely. You've been brought in to work on sales and Bitcoin mining. And it's like, I have no interest or skills in any of these. What the hell? I think we've made a mistake. So yeah, it's success could mean early exit, as dark as that sounds.
I've never heard someone say that, but it makes sense. Success is say exit. You're like, how do you succeed? How do you succeed in your first 90 days? You're like, I got out.
Yes, yes. I found out I wasn't gonna make it, so I voluntarily left. Um, yeah,
That's
it's
really dark, but it's somewhat. That's very truthful. It's like there is going to be a point for some people that they're going to realize that either they don't want to work there or it's not going to happen.
no,
And then I guess at that point you do just the how you succeed in those 90 days is take as much as you can and start finding somewhere else to go
Yeah.
and hit the giant reset button, I guess.
Yeah.
So
here's a curveball for you with the 90 days. I'm working 100% remotely. This is the first time where I have been told, thankfully, because I would have been completely oblivious to this, that I need to create a social network for myself beyond my team. And I'm only going to get exposure to the internal team I'm working with and the little cross-functional interactions we have as we go. But that's very slow to upskill. So we are being told, like, meet with people. If you've chatted to someone in a group setting for whatever reason, take down their name, ping them later and be like, hey, how is your onboarding going? Tell me about what your area of expertise are. And make the network there, because these are connections you're not going to get. Like my previous experiences when I've started at a company, you arrive, you meet the team, it's great. You go for coffee, you pass someone in the hallway, and that person knows someone you work with, and you end up getting caught in a conversation. Now you know someone else.
Yep.
Remote, that doesn't happen. There is no virtual water cooler that you just hang out at and have conversation. And you need that insight, because you don't want to be in a big company and the only person you're hearing information from is your manager. I think that's a scary place to be.
Okay, yeah.
So that's
I was going to say that where I work, what they have is we use Slack, so they have something called Donut.
Oh yeah.
And it just pairs people.
Oh.
Every week you get a new paired paired person.
That's awesome.
And the execs are in that group. You just leave the Slack channel if you don't want to be paired, but it doesn't look so great if you don't do that, because you want to be a social outcast. I mean, it's a little bit different if you're someone who was there prior to COVID and you do know most people, but you also have to think, like, you don't know everyone.
No, exactly.
Because, we're on almost 2 years of working remote, so there's going to be people you've never met. And I will say it's awkward because it's people that you not necessarily wouldn't talk to.
Yes.
Versus being in the office, you're getting coffee and you hear something of interest.
Yeah.
Or you're sitting down at lunch and you're like, hey, what were you talking about? Blah, blah, blah project. Versus the donut stuff is more forced. Like, you've just been paired with someone, and then you're like, do I really want to have a meeting with X department? Like, I don't know what they're going to talk about. I don't even know what they do.
Yeah.
And I mean, you could say, Corey, that's a great talking point right there. You're like, hey, no offense, but I don't know what Department X does and what Team Y does in the company. So that helps. Also, I think every time you're in a team and they're like, oh, Bob and blah, blah, blah sent us over, like, those are the people who should be noting down and be like, well, could you intro me to Bob? I would like to talk more about that. Like, I'm interested. I know I'm not going to work directly on that. I know that has nothing to do with what I'm doing, but it sounds like a very interesting person. And then all of a sudden you build out that network. I haven't had a remote only company. I've worked at companies even before COVID where there was remote teams, and I had managed a remote team even, but they were in an office, and I was in HQ office. So, and then now where I am, it was prior to COVID. So all that network got built out, or a large bulk of that network got built out. And I don't think you need a huge amount. Like, you just need that establishment. Once you get that sort of ring of people, then you can get to further and further out.
They're sort of like, this is so geeky. They're sort of like egress nodes. They're the way to get out of your team. Because if you're just connecting with your team and it's a new team, or the company is going through hypergrowth and everyone who's being brought on is the same position as you, you're with an echo chamber and you don't know about other teams. And you can have huge impact later on when you say to someone like, hey, I'm having an issue with this log problem. We've got so much noise in our log. And they go, you know what? Actually, Like we had the same problem. We went through, fixed all the things. It turns out that like a 2 dot release versions higher on this package fixes everything. And you do one line change somewhere and you're good to go. You're like, oh, that's amazing. So there's a lot of that can be beneficial, but there's also some sense of your manager says to you, the org thinks we're the most important thing right now. Everyone is investing all the time in our product, which I'm sure everyone's heard. Then you sit down with a buddy who's in another team and she says, so are you guys doing okay? We heard that there's going to be layoffs. And you're like, what? Hold on. Neither of you may be correct at all. However, you've got some diversity into what the hell is going on. And you can find out where and what's happening. So yeah.
Yeah. When you live in your own bubble, you think you're the greatest thing ever.
Yes.
And then you get outside of that bubble and it could be entirely opposite thing. Everyone else in the org can actually like dislike your team, think your team is not performing, like this, whatever you can think of, really. And sometimes it is true. Like there'll be a team saying like we're a critical service to the company, and then you go talk around and the company's like, that team is critical to the operations. But you want confirmation of that and not just bias of being in that bubble going, yeah, we're the best.
So now there's an interesting one for you as well. You coincidentally meet the person who's part of the ops org, and 2 weeks in, you're in a meeting. Your boss says, I'm trying the best I can to get the ops folks to help us out. They are swamped. You go for lunch and you say to the ops person you've been hanging out with, hey, what's happening? Can you at least give me some guidance to like get the ball rolling here? You're a rock star. You have just jumped the line in a sensible way. You haven't pushed your way in and you've utilized it. So those connections, at least from a remote perspective, are going to be very hard to establish later on. The first 90 days when you're doing all the onboarding, you're exposed to people of various levels, you're exposed to people of various teams. That's important. So that's probably something you want to do.
Yeah, like I wouldn't say that's so much political, but having alliances or favors, even having a sense of being like, oh, I know Andre. Andre's a great person. Andre helped me with that log. And then I can go, hey, Andre, I know you're really swamped, but could you just run this one command on this one thing to get me X? And you're like, well, remember that time that Corey helped me? Okay, yeah, I'll do it.
There we go.
Yeah. And it's a piece of me hates that because it's like this broken thing in the system. It's because you just skip priority and but that's the reality of the world we live in.
Unfortunately, I think there is a bit of it where it can be leveraged in a very abusive way. However, there are cases where, in my case, someone said to me, I'm trying to do this thing. We're having lunch. Do you have any guidance for me? Like, don't set up a meeting. Don't do anything. Just like while we're sitting here on a Friday afternoon having lunch, just what can I do over the weekend to potentially help me out? I was like, cool. Have you tried this, and this? Like, this is what's happening. Or like, is there some guidance you can provide me with something? It costs you nothing, and it's not really jumping the queue as much as it's giving you some insight. So yeah, that's probably important. I know that there are some people who push it to the extreme, who try very strategically making friends with the teams that can get you unblocked, like any kind of provisioning, any kind of approval, like all the long running tasks. So yeah, there's an abuse aspect.
Something I've heard before is like what is it? It's something like the person who's been at the company the longest is able to get the most work done, not because necessarily they're the most productive person, but because they have access to so many different resources in the company and or legitimate access to systems. And sometimes they're not even supposed to actually have access to these systems.
Completely.
It's like, well, they used to be on three teams ago on that team. They never revoked the access, and even though they're not supposed to have it, they still do.
It's exactly that. If you find one or two of those ninja operators, every company has them. That person who said, can I get root access? And they said, we think you should have root access so you can help us. And that person who can get you through all the
They've just been
loopholes and everything,
grandfathered
just
in
the
now.
whole thing. Yeah, exactly that. And those are scary people because they can make or break what's happening. But I think that's something else that people miss, because it's an early win. You can get those connections early on and make it work. So yeah. But I don't know what
That
else.
should be our next talk.
What
should be I don't know what it'd be titled, but like dealing in a remote only company, I guess.
Yeah. How to make that work. It's been interesting. I've had to learn to become a lot more extroverted and just message people out of the blue and be like, hey, how's your lunch going? Like,
are you still able to go to the office at all? Or are you within distance of an office?
Yeah, I'm very conveniently located to an office, like 45 minutes away or 30 minutes away from the office that I'm kind of reporting to. I'm allowed to go in for, like, right now it's kind of iffy. The same situation as the previous company I was at, where you can only go in for business purpose. So none of the cool amenities are open. And when they do open, I'll be able to go in like a couple of times a week, or once or twice a week, or once every 2 weeks or something like that. But if my entire team is located there, I can see that changing very, very quickly and rules being massaged to suit the manager. But I think there's something about the physical meetups as well that I think is important. Like, I never met people who joined. There were people who I helped out, who joined my team and mentored them, and I never met them in person, and it was a strange experience. So I think they missed a little bit of that. But yeah, I don't know. I think the remote situation is going to be a new way of operating, new rules entirely. So.
Well, I wish you the best. Hopefully this is not the next, in another 50 days for like topic. How to keep your job not like Andre.
Yes, exactly.
or the topic is like, Andre, how did you not keep your job?
Our mental breakdowns. Yeah, our mental breakdowns that bad. Yeah, this it'll be interesting. No, it's a definitely the first 90-day situation. Also, if all the things we've spoken about are recommendations based on personal experience, assuming you have leeway that doesn't fall outside of whatever's been given to you. Apparently, some companies now, when they onboard junior engineers, you are on rails. There's no, you eat lunch when lunch is planned for you. You meet when meetings are planned for you, and it's not a prison camp. It's a formula for success according to them. And if you abide by them, you will meet people outside. You will do things that are in line with what the company wants. You'll understand the core values. You'll expose yourself to all the things that are needed, and you're good to go. So yeah, it's not always that crazy.
You'll be fine. I mean, the topic is like, for most devs, like, you'll just be fine, honestly. Like, it's pretty hard to not succeed if you've already gone through all the interviewing and everything. It would be more about like individual, you don't want to be there for most people, or you realize it's not a company for you, or the team's not for you, or the product isn't for you, or it wasn't what you expected. But the topic was just in general more like, how do you propel that faster? Like, how do you accelerate that? But I think that's a good spot.
Perfect.
So we will end.
Awesome. Until next week.
Yep, until next week.